Hi everybody, I'm Daniel Salt and welcome to part 2 of our saxophone series. Today we're tackling how to put on a reed. Putting on a reed is a very simple part of playing a saxophone, but it's an easy to mess up part. And it's one of the most common problems that I see when I go and work with schools' saxophone players, or sometimes even when I look at my students' reeds, they're not in a very good spot. So a big part of what we do is I take their saxophones and I put the reed on myself, and a lot of students are amazed at how much better they can play just by getting the reed in exactly the right spot. So even though if you feel like you already know how to put on a reed, you might check this out because it may help you. Even the tiniest little difference in where you put the reed makes a huge change in how well the saxophone plays. So most people, when they put on their reed, they have their reed, they get it wet, the top at least, this part being the top, and they put it on their mouthpiece, and they sort of hold it in place with their thumb, and they put their ligature on. Or some people put the ligature on first and kind of slide the reed down. That's probably a safer way to do it. And then they get their ligature and they tighten it down, and that's sort of that. There's a few problems with that. And most people, when they're positioning the reed, they say the reed should be a little bit lower than the end of the mouthpiece. Maybe something like that, so you can see a little mouthpiece sticking up. But there's a few problems with that. And of course, there's going to be some personal preference in exactly where you put your reed. But if you're just starting out playing, or if you've only been playing for a couple of years, I know that's a long time still, but you really want to be careful about where you put the reed. And until you've been playing for 4 or 5 or 6 years, this is a really great spot to put your reed. This is where I put my reed. This is where my saxophone teachers put their reed. And they're all professional level players, okay? So one of the first problems with this is that when we get the reed wet, if we get just this top part here wet, it won't have a good seal against the mouthpiece. So even though that part's wet, when I put it on my mouthpiece, it falls off. And what that means is when I put my ligature on, no matter how tight I tighten down that ligature, there's going to be air escaping between the reed and the mouthpiece. And that happens because it's not a watertight or not an airtight seal. So that's where a lot of that kind of spitty sounds, or if you hear that kind of popping noise, that is where a lot of that sound comes from, is that the reed is just not wet enough. So when you get your reed wet, you need to get the whole thing wet, the top, bottom, the front, and the back. Okay, the whole reed should be in your mouth so that it's all wet. And if you do that the right way, when you put your reed on, it will stick to the mouthpiece even without the ligature. And there's no fear for me that it's going to fall off because that's an airtight seal. And all the ligature does then is it gives us that extra support so that when we put pressure on the reed, it will stay. All right? When you're putting the ligature on, you want to make sure that it is below the vibrating part of the reed. Some have sort of a U shape. This particular reed is flat across like that. And you want to make sure the ligature is below that. Okay? And of course, all ligatures are different, or at least a lot of them are different. But no matter what ligature you have, if you're looking at it, the screw is going to point to the right, if it's the right way. So if you ever see, no matter what brand, no matter what kind it is, there's never been one made where the screws go to the left. So if you have a student, or if you are a student and the screws are going left, I promise it's on backwards, okay? So let's talk about exactly how to get that reed in the right spot, because we know it's going to stick. That's good, okay? We put our ligature on, that's fine. Or some people put the ligature and then slide the reed under, that's okay too. But either way, it needs to stick without the ligature first. Then we're going to look at the end of the reed. This is another problem that people have, is they say that reed should be a little lower than the mouthpiece. And that's really not true, if I'm being honest. We want the reed and the mouthpiece to be exactly even. Because if you slide the reed, for example, if this is the mouthpiece and this is the reed, if we slide the reed lower than the mouthpiece, what we end up with is less of the reed vibrating. So sometimes that can make a reed easier to play, but instead of having this much of the reed vibrating, we're only having this much of the reed vibrating. And then the more reed that vibrates, the better sound we're going to get and the easier it's going to be to play. And also the easier it's going to be to tongue, which we're going to talk about in a future episode. So we want that reed to stick. We want the end of the reed and the end of the mouthpiece to be exactly the same. I'm hoping you can see that. And then we don't want it twisted sideways either way. So the way I check that when I'm looking at my mouthpiece is that I run my thumb and my index finger along the sides of the reed. And that lets you feel even the tiniest little change. If you feel it poking out one side or the other, you know that that reed's twisted. And you should take off your ligature or loosen your ligature so you can straighten it out. Also, when you put your ligature on, you want the ligature to be as tight as possible. You want that ligature to hold the reed on no matter what. And a lot of people are afraid to over tighten their ligature. I hear that word a lot. And especially if you have a metal ligature, which I recommend, there's almost no level that I can turn on this and have it break. If you were really super strong, maybe you could, but it should be like almost as tight as you can get it. And if you do that, you're going to get a really solid seal against the mouthpiece, and it's going to be really easy to play comparatively. For that same reason, I don't recommend leather ligatures, because leather ligatures stretch out over time. So to get a really good seal, you have to crank down, and eventually they stretch and are looser anyway. And if you're okay buying a ligature every year or so, that's okay if you really love the leather ligature. But that's about how long they last, if that long. So I usually buy a metal ligature because I think it gives me a better result. And it lasts a lot longer, so it's cheaper in the long run. Okay. But I have to stress the emphasis of getting that reed to stick. Even now, if I take my ligature off, that reed is still stuck on there with no help from me. And it is exactly even with the top of the mouthpiece. If you do that and you get your ligature on tight, you should be pretty well set up to start playing.